The first plate she set down was for the smaller boy. Clara Macklin had been on the Hale Ranch exactly 4 hours when she spooned stew into a cracked bowl, placed it in front of 5-year-old Sam, and tucked the napkin into his collar before the child even looked up. Eli, the older one, got his next. She filled his portion higher because she had already noticed his wrists growing out past his cuffs and guessed he was in the middle of a growth that nobody had thought to keep pace with. Thomas Hale received the third plate. He sat at the head of the table with sawdust still caught in the creases of his knuckles and said nothing while she moved around the kitchen like a woman who had memorized its measurements on the walk from the front door. She did not sit down. She stood near the stove and watched the three of them eat, and when Sam pushed a chunk of potato to the edge of his bowl, she leaned over and cut it smaller without being asked. Only after the boys had cleaned their plates and Thomas had set down his fork did she take what remained in the pot and eat standing up, her back half turned toward the wall, as though feeding herself was something best done out of sight. Thomas noticed. He did not say a word about it. Not that night, and not the next morning when she did exactly the same thing with breakfast. He had placed the advertisement in the Copper Hill Gazette 5 weeks before she arrived. Housekeeper needed. 2 children. Remote property. Wages modest. Inquire by letter to T. Hale, Thornton Creek, Wyoming Territory. He had written the notice in the same plain hand he used for cattle tallies, pressed hard into the paper because the pencil was dull, and he had not expected much. The ranch sat 40 minutes from the nearest town by horse, an hour by wagon, and the road turned to mud whenever the sky decided to open. His wife, Nettie, had been gone 14 months. The house still held the faint ghost of her lavender soap in the back closet where he could not bring himself to move the last bar. But everywhere else it smelled like dust and bacon grease and 2 boys who needed someone to tell them when to wash. 6 women had seen that advertisement. Only Clara answered. She arrived on the Tuesday supply wagon with a single carpet bag and a letter of reference from a minister in Cheyenne whose handwriting was so small and cramped Thomas had to hold it near the lamp just to make out the words. She was 34. Thin, not frail, but lean in the way that told him she had spent more seasons skipping meals than sitting down to them. Her dress was clean and pressed and mended at both elbows with stitching so careful it took a second look to find it. She stepped off the wagon, set her bag on the porch, and looked at the house. She looked at the warped second step, the barn leaning slightly east, the fence line missing 2 rails on the south side. She did not flinch. She did not ask about the condition of the place or offer commentary on the peeling paint above the front door. Where did the boys sleep? That was the first thing she asked. Not what her wages would be, not how far the nearest neighbor lived, not whether the well water ran clean. She wanted to know where the children slept, and Thomas pointed upstairs before he fully understood why that question moved something behind his ribs that had been locked shut for over a year. She started that same afternoon. By dusk, the kitchen floor was scrubbed to the color it had been before mud season. The boys had clean shirts laid out for morning. A pot of stew sat on the stove, sending up the kind of steam that made the house feel inhabited again. Thomas stood in the doorway and watched Clara wipe down the table with a rag she had already rinsed 3 times, wringing it with hands that were red from the water and strong from whatever work had come before this place. He thought, this woman works like someone who believes rest is a thing that must be earned, and she has not earned it yet. He said nothing. The pattern held through the week like a heartbeat. Wednesday breakfast she served the boys first. Eggs scrambled with a little dried sage she had found at the back of the pantry, and biscuits she had mixed and cut before the sun cleared the ridge. She poured Thomas his coffee and set the cup exactly where his hand would reach without him having to look up from the stock journal he read each morning. Then she fed the boys seconds. Sam wanted another biscuit. Eli wanted more egg. She gave them both without measuring, without hesitation, as though their appetites were something she had already memorized. Then she cleared the table. She scraped the plates. She stacked the dishes by size. Only when the kitchen was quiet and every surface was wiped and the flour canister was back on its shelf did she take what was left in the skillet and eat it standing by the stove, her shoulders angled slightly away, as though she did not want anyone to see her chewing. Thursday was the same. Friday, Saturday, Thomas watched her through all of it. He watched the way she placed each plate precisely where it needed to be, angled so the fork fell to the right hand. He watched her cut Sam's food without being asked, refill Eli's water glass before the boy noticed it was low, and move through the kitchen with the kind of economy that only comes from years of making meals in rooms that were not hers. She never sat. She never served herself at the same time she served them. She never once took the first portion or the largest piece or even a full share of what she had cooked. She ate what was left, standing, every single time. Sam was the first to notice something Thomas had been too careful to name. It was Thursday evening. Clara had cleared the supper dishes and was standing at the basin washing them, her sleeves rolled above her elbows and the lamplight catching the raw, reddened skin on her knuckles. Sam climbed down from his chair. He crossed the kitchen floor in his stocking feet, carrying his own small cup in both hands with the careful grip of a boy performing an important task. He walked to the counter and placed the cup beside the stack of dishes Clara had not yet reached. He did not say anything. He set it down, looked up at her face, waited one full breath, and then walked back to the table where Eli was drawing horses on a piece of brown wrapping paper. Clara stopped washing. Her hands went still in the water. Thomas could see the side of her face from where he stood in the sitting room doorway, and he watched her expression shift. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to recognition. The look of a woman hearing a sentence in a language she understood but had not heard spoken to her in so long she had almost forgotten its sound. Then she continued washing. Her hands moved again. The cloth circled the inside of a bowl. But her shoulders had changed. Something in her posture had opened by a fraction, the way a door opens when the latch is not quite caught and the wind finds it. Thomas saw the whole thing. He saw his 5-year-old son carry that cup across the kitchen floor with the solemn concentration of a child who had made a decision about a person and was acting on it in the only way he knew how. And he saw Clara hold still the way people hold still when a kindness catches them unprepared and they need a moment to make sure it is real before they can let themselves believe it. He pressed his shoulder against the doorframe. And he said nothing at all. By Friday morning, Clara had mended the torn hinge on the barn door using a piece of strap leather and a nail she pulled from the scrap pile behind the chicken house. Thomas found the repair when he went to open the door at first light, and it swung clean, and even for the first time in 6 months. He stood there running his thumb over the place where the leather wrapped the iron. And he could tell by the tightness of the knot that she had done it with cold hands, probably before dawn, while the frost was still white on the grass and the boys were still sleeping. He walked back to the house. Breakfast was already on the table. The boys were eating. Clara was at the stove. She had also patched the draft under the back door with a rolled flour sack stuffed tight against the gap where the cold air used to seep in and pool around the boys' ankles when they sat at the table. She had reorganized the pantry so the older stock sat in front and the newer tins went behind, which was something Nettie had always done and Thomas had stopped doing after she passed because he could not bear to stand in that small space and remember her hands arranging the same shelves. Clara did not know any of that history. She had simply seen a disorder and corrected it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who believed that problems existed to be solved, not discussed. Thomas saw all of it. The mended hinge, the sealed draft, the ordered pantry, the pressed shirts folded on the boys' beds, the firewood she had restacked by size near the back door so the kindling was always within reach. Each repair was small on its own, but together they amounted to something he had not felt in 14 months. The house was being held. Someone was paying attention to the cracks, and the cracks were closing. That afternoon, Mrs. Florence Leland came by. She owned the nearest property, 3 miles east along the creek road, and she had a way of arriving with a basket of preserves and a head full of opinions that she delivered with the same generous confidence. She sat on the porch while Clara was inside with the boys, and she looked at Thomas with the measuring gaze of a woman who had known his wife and felt herself entitled to an honest assessment of what came after. People in town are talking. Thomas, he knew what she meant. A single man, a woman living under his roof, no ring, no arrangement the town could point to and approve. The territory was forgiving about many things, but a woman's reputation was not counted among them. She is my housekeeper, Florence. Florence looked at the porch step that no longer squeaked. She looked at the clean windows. She looked at the shirt Thomas was wearing, which had been pressed with an iron for the first time since Nettie died. She seems capable. She is. And what happens when someone offers her a better position? Sarah Blake at the boarding house has been looking for kitchen help since spring. Better wages, closer to the church, a proper room instead of whatever you have her in. There is nothing keeping her here, Thomas. You understand that. Thomas had not let himself think this far. The idea landed in his chest like a stone dropped into a well, heavy and sinking and making a sound that traveled outward through the quiet water. Clara could leave. She was a hired woman with no claim on this land and no obligation beyond the work. If someone offered her better wages or a shorter ride to town or a place where the road did not turn to mud every time the sky darkened, she would have every reason to go. And nothing, not one thing he had given her, would be a reason to stay. He looked at the kitchen window. Through the glass he could see Clara at the counter rolling out pie dough while Sam sat on the floor near her feet, playing with the scrap wood blocks that Thomas had cut for him months ago and nobody had smoothed until Clara took a rough stone to them earlier in the week. The boy was building a small tower. He was building it directly beside her foot, close enough that his shoulder touched her ankle each time he reached for a new block, and he did not seem to notice. Or perhaps he noticed completely, and that was exactly the point. She has not mentioned leaving. Women do not always mention it before they go. Florence collected her basket and stood. I am only saying you might think about what this house looks like without her in it, now that you know what it looks like with her. She left. Thomas sat on the porch for a long time after, listening to the sounds inside the house. Clara was humming something low and tuneless while she worked. Not really a song, more of a murmur that filled the kitchen the way warmth fills a room when the fire is tended properly. He could hear Sam talking to himself as he played, narrating the construction of his tower in the private, earnest voice of a child who believes someone is listening even when he is not checked to see. Clara fixed the squeaking porch step on Saturday morning. Thomas heard the hammering from the barn where he was reshoeing the draft horse, and when he came inside for water, the second step was silent for the first time since the previous spring. She was already back in the kitchen. She had flour on her forearms and was rolling out dough for a pie made with the last of the dried apples she had found in the root cellar. The boys mentioned they like apple. She offered the explanation without looking up, as though she needed a practical reason for the pie beyond the fact that she had noticed a preference and decided to honor it. They do. Thomas filled his cup from the pitcher and drank it standing beside the table. He could smell cinnamon. Nettie had never used cinnamon in her apple pie. It was a small difference, barely worth naming, but it made the kitchen smell like Clara rather than like memory, and Thomas was surprised to find that he did not mind. That the difference was not a loss, that it was simply a new thing growing in a space where he had believed nothing new could grow. That same afternoon, Eli came in from the south fence line with a splinter buried deep in the pad of his thumb. It was the kind that needed a needle, steady light, and a person willing to hold a 9-year-old boy's hand without making him feel small for needing it held. Thomas was in the far pasture checking on a cow that had gone lame. He would not be back for an hour. Eli stood in the kitchen doorway, pressing his thumb against his chest, his jaw tight, his eyes bright and wet and fighting it with everything a boy of 9 can summon when he believes that pain is something to be endured without witness. Clara saw him from across the kitchen. She did not rush toward him. She did not exclaim or cluck or fuss. She pulled a chair to the window where the afternoon light was strongest, sat down, and took the sewing needle from the tin on the shelf. She held the needle in the candle flame for a slow count of 3 and then held out her open hand. Not reaching for him, just offering. Letting him decide. Eli crossed the room. He sat in the chair facing her and placed his hand in hers, and Clara bent over his thumb with the careful focus of a woman who understood that this moment had nothing to do with a splinter. She worked the needle gently, turning it with the same patience she brought to everything else in this house. She did not tell him to be brave. She did not tell him it would be quick. When the thin sliver of wood came free, she pressed a folded clean cloth to the spot and held it there, and then she looked at him, and her eyes were steady and kind and unhurried. All done. Eli looked at his thumb. He looked at her face. He sat there one full breath longer than he needed to, his hand still resting in hers, and in that breath Clara did not pull away or pat his hand or tell him he had been strong. She simply held still and let the boy decide when he was ready to let go. He pulled his hand back. He stood up and walked outside without a word, but he left the kitchen differently than he had entered it. His shoulders sat lower. His jaw had loosened. He walked the way a child walks when something frightening has been handled by someone competent and kind, and the world has become, for the moment, a fraction more trustworthy than it was before. That evening, Thomas found the boys at the table while Clara served supper, thick stew with carrots and onion and the last of the salt pork. She set Sam's bowl down first, then Eli's, then Thomas's. She moved to the stove to eat what remained. Thomas watched his older son. Eli was quieter than usual, but there was something different in him, a looseness in his shoulders, a way of glancing toward Clara at the stove that was not suspicion anymore. It was attention, the particular kind of watching a boy does when he is beginning to believe that a person might stay, and he is testing the idea carefully, the way you test ice at the edge of a creek before you trust it with your full weight. It was Saturday night. Tomorrow would be Sunday. Thomas sat in his chair after the boys were asleep and stared at the kitchen table in the low lamplight. The house was quiet. Clara had gone to the small room off the back hall, and the only sounds were the wind pressing against the north wall and the soft shifting of cattle in the barn. He had watched her for 5 full days, 5 breakfasts, 5 suppers. She fed his boys before she fed herself every single time, and she did it without performance, without sigh, without any sign that she expected to be thanked or even noticed. It was not show. It was simply the order of things as Clara Macklin understood them. The children ate first. The man of the house ate next. She ate last, standing with whatever remained in the pot. It was the standing that kept him awake. Not because it violated any rule he knew. She was a hired woman. and hired women did not always sit at the family table. He understood this. He had grown up in a household where the help ate in the kitchen after the family finished, and nobody questioned the arrangement, and nobody lost a night of sleep over it. But Clara was not standing because of custom. She was standing because she believed, somewhere deep in the structure of who she was, that she did not belong at the table, that her hunger came last, that she was the kind of person who waited until everyone else was satisfied and then took from what was left, quietly, almost apologetically, not because anyone had commanded this of her, but because she had lived long enough without anyone telling her otherwise that the silence itself had become the rule. Thomas had buried a wife. He knew what it cost a woman to pour herself into a household. Nettie had done it with noise and joy and laughter and her boots off and her feet up on the porch rail on Sunday afternoons, because she believed that rest was her God-given right and she intended to exercise it. Clara did not believe that. Clara believed she was the last plate, the portion left in the pot, the one who stood while others sat. And Thomas had let 5 days pass in silence because the words were too large for the quiet kitchen and too important to get wrong, and because he feared that naming what he saw would either break it or reveal it as something he was not yet ready to hold. But it was Sunday now, and the silence had run its course. She was up before dawn. Thomas heard her moving in the kitchen. The stove door, the scrape of the coffee pot across the iron surface, the soft sound of her footsteps on the floor she had scrubbed 3 days ago. He dressed and came downstairs before the boys were awake. Clara was at the counter with her back to him. Coffee was ready. Biscuits were in the oven. She had set out 3 plates and 3 cups. Thomas went to the cabinet. He took down a 4th plate and a 4th cup and carried them to the table and set them beside the other 3. Clara turned at the sound. She looked at the table. She looked at him. "Sit down this morning." He did not frame it as a question. He did not soften it with explanation or wrap it inside a reason she could refuse. He said it the way he drove a fence post, straight down, with everything behind it. Clara did not move. "The boys are not up yet, I know." Thomas pulled out the chair at the place where the 4th plate sat. He pulled it out and left it there. Open, angled toward her. "I have watched you feed them before you feed yourself every morning and every evening since you walked through that door. I have watched you eat standing up and take what is left after everyone else is done, and I have said nothing because I did not know how to say it right." He was not a man who made speeches. The longest thing he had spoken in a month was a prayer over Nettie's grave marker when he replaced the wildflowers the wind had scattered. "You sit at this table. You eat when we eat. You do not stand. Not in this house. Not anymore." Clara's hands were still at her sides. She looked at the chair. She looked at the 4 plates arranged on the table. She looked at Thomas, and in her face he could see the argument forming, the reasons she should refuse, the long years of believing she was the kind of woman who stood. "I was hired to keep house. You were hired to be here." Thomas heard the words leave him and knew they were true in a way that had no edges, no qualifications, no room for retreat, and people who belong here sit down. The stove ticked as the fire settled. The coffee sent a thin curl of steam toward the ceiling. Outside, the rooster announced the hour with his full conviction, and the first pale light of Sunday morning pressed through the east window and fell in a long, warm stripe across the kitchen floor. Clara sat down. She lowered herself into the 4th chair at the table and folded her hands in her lap, and for a moment she looked like a woman who had been walking a very long road and had just been told she did not have to walk anymore. Thomas poured her coffee. He set the cup in front of her the way she set his in front of him each morning, placed exactly where her hand would find it without searching. The boys came down 10 minutes later. Sam appeared first, barefoot and dragging a blanket he was too old to carry, but that nobody had the heart to take from him. He climbed into his chair and saw Clara sitting at the table. He did not pause. He did not blink. He did not register anything unusual. He looked at her as though she had always been sitting there, and the only surprising thing was that it had taken the rest of them so long to see it. Eli came next. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at the table. He looked at Clara and her chair, at the plate in front of her, at the cup of coffee his father had poured. He looked at Thomas. Then he walked to the table and sat down. Clara served the biscuits, 2 on Sam's plate, 2 on Eli's, 2 on Thomas's. Then her hand paused above her own plate, and Thomas saw the hesitation, the old habit pulling at her, the deep, worn groove whispering that she should wait, go last, take only what remained after everyone else was fed. Go on. Thomas said it quietly, not a command this time. An offering. Clara placed 2 biscuits on her own plate. She picked up her fork. She ate sitting down at the table with the family, while the Sunday morning light came through the window and fell warm across her hands and across the wood and across the 4 plates set in a row like the simplest possible proof that she was counted among them. Sam finished his breakfast and looked at Clara with the clear, uncomplicated certainty of a child who sees the truth of things before the adults around him find the nerve to speak it. You are staying. It was not a question. It was the plain, settled declaration of a 5-year-old boy who understood something the grown people in this house had been circling all week. Clara looked at Sam. She looked at Thomas. Thomas held her eyes. He is right. Clara's fork rested on the edge of her plate. Her eyes were bright and full, but she did not cry. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. But her chin lifted slightly, the way a person's chin lifts when they are holding something enormous inside a space that was never built to contain it, and they are determined to hold it all the same. Then, I am staying. Eli pushed his clean plate forward. He stood up from his chair and walked around the table and stopped beside Clara. He did not hug her. He did not say anything large or dramatic. He placed his hand on the back of her chair, the way his father rested a hand on a fence rail when he was looking out over something he had decided to keep, and he held it there for 3 long seconds before he turned and walked outside to start his chores. Clara watched him go. Her hand rose to the back of the chair where his hand had been, and her fingers settled there on the warm wood. Thomas began clearing the dishes. He stacked them the way she always did, largest on the bottom, cups hooked on his fingers. Clara started to rise. I will get those. You cooked. He carried the stack to the basin and turned the water. I wash. She sat back down. She sat at the table with the morning light warming the wood and the sound of Thomas running water over the plates and the soft distant noise of Eli's boots crossing the yard and Sam humming to himself as he pulled on his socks by the stove. She sat there with coffee she had not poured for herself and a plate that still held the warmth of the biscuit she had eaten alongside the people she was beginning, carefully and without presumption, to love. Outside the window, the cottonwood shook its last yellow leaves in the November wind. The ranch spread toward the creek, battered and leaning and stubborn, held together by the kind of effort that builds a life from land that does not owe you a thing. The 4th plate stayed on that table every morning after. Nobody ever moved it.